Okay, I'm sure this has been pretty obnoxious, but this is the very last time I'm going to ask you to do this. I want you to create another React app from scratch. Obviously, the repetition is going to be really good for you. And what this React app should do is render an app component, which should be in its own file. And the app component should render 5 joke components. We can see that this is going to help us practice the parent-child component tree. It's going to help us practice putting components in their own files. But the main thing we're going to practice is passing props down through the joke component. So each joke component should receive a question prop and a punchline prop, and then render those to the page however you want. Now that's just kind of the basic part of the practice, but I've added a little extra credit section, which I'd really encourage you to try. So in this case, if your component does not receive a question prop, you need to think, how might you make it so that it only shows the punchline instead? For example, if you've hard-coded in a question text that says question colon and then props.question, obviously the syntax is incomplete, but how are you going to make it so that you don't have question colon and then an empty space? Also, while you're at it, see what happens when React receives a prop that's undefined. If you don't have a question colon and you're also not passing down a question prop, see what happens. And while you're at it, spend some time practicing the style of your joke component. Make it look good. So pause the video, do this practice, and we'll go through this together in just a few seconds. All right, I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to actually leave some of these comments here just so that I can remember exactly what to do. We know we need to, in a basic setup, import React and React, import React DOM from React DOM. I'm going to use React DOM to render our app. We're going to put it at the root element. We don't have app, so I'm going to import app from a file called app that doesn't yet exist. And I'll create that file now. Capital A app.js. Over in that file, I need to again import React from React. For the app component that I'm about to make. We'll wrap everything in a div. Okay, and here we're going to render our 5 joke components. That should be capital J. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now for this to know what I'm talking about when I am trying to create an instance of a joke component, I will need to import that. And that doesn't exist yet, so let's make that. I'll create a file called capital J joke.js. And over in joke.js, once again, import React from React, default joke. And before I get too deep into playing with props, I'm going to just have it render something simple just to see if it's working. I may have forgotten something, but let's check this out. Okay, I get my 5 highs on the screen, which means my 5 joke components are working. React.render is rendering the app component. The app component is rendering a div with 5 joke components, and the joke component is just rendering an h1. And that's how I'm getting 5 highs on the screen, and that's the tree that we're working with. While I'm still in this file, I'm going to work on the props here. So I know that I need to pass in a variable. I'm going to call it props because that's the standard. And let's start with something simple. I'm going to render a div with maybe a couple h3s inside. One will have the question. One will have the answer. If you had gotten stuck anytime before this, I'd really like you to pause the video and go review these things that we just went over and then try it again from scratch. You can go back in time to the beginning and actually try to build this out yourself. Then once that makes sense, come back to this point and move on. Now, if everything did make sense up to this point, pause the video here and see if you can figure out how are we going to get the question from our joke that's being passed in. Of course, right now it's not yet being passed in, but when it is, how are we going to place it right here? Remember, we're inside of JSX right now, so I can't just say props.question because that would literally put the text props.question here. When I want to go inside of JavaScript, I need to surround it in curly braces. Notice that I get nothing on the screen. Think for a second why that might be. Let's actually console log props.question. I'll open the console and see what shows up. Notice that I get null. That's because this joke component, when I'm creating instances of it in my app, I'm not actually passing in a question or a punchline prop. So when React tries to render a component and we're not passing it any props, everything will be set as null. What's really cool about React is if any JavaScript inside of JSX evaluates to something like undefined or null, it simply won't display it. This right here is going to be something we need to figure out how to fix when we have our joke components that don't take a question prop. But for now, let's assume that they all have a question and an answer or a punchline. So over here, I'm going to also add props.punchline. And I can delete my console log here. Let's go back to app.js and let's actually provide a question and punchline for every one of these jokes. As I mentioned in a previous lesson, I prefer to put these on their own lines if they start to get so long that they're wrapping around. You may decide this isn't your style, and that's totally up to you. I still go back and forth as to whether I want this closing angle bracket to be on the previous line or not. So let's refresh this and see what we get. Cool. everything's a little bit squished together, so you may decide to do something simple like at the end of a joke, you may put a little break tag, or maybe something like a horizontal rule. But obviously, however you want to style it is totally up to you. And there we have the basics of the first part of our exercise. Now, as we see in the extra credits, some jokes are only a punchline with no question. And as it stands, I have this hard-coded word question colon space here. When I provide a joke that doesn't have a question, like my favorite one that only has a punchline, you'll see when I re-render this, I get question with nothing there. We're going to talk in a future lesson about conditionally rendering parts of our page. But for now, think about the way that we style our page and see if you can think of a way that we can make this disappear if there is no question. Pause the video and give that a shot. Again, there's actually going to be a real way we do this with something called conditional rendering. But for now, you may find a way around it where you can say, I want this H3 to have a style with a display of none under certain circumstances. What if right here I used a ternary operator to decide what that should be? Inside of my object, I could say essentially is props dot question a thing? Is it truthy? If so, display it in the regular block format, but otherwise display it as none. Notice that my first one has an H3 that is now display none because it no longer has props.question. If you're not very familiar with ternaries, I highly recommend you go spend some time learning about them because they're actually used quite often in React. Another slightly more concise but perhaps more confusing way to write this would be instead of using a ternary and having a default of its own default, like an H3 being display block, we can get rid of that and we could actually say if there isn't a props.question, then we want to display none. But otherwise, basically ignore this rule totally. If you're not familiar with using the double ampersand in this way, we're going to talk about it in a future lesson. But just know for now, this totally works. You can see over in my browser, I have just an answer on my joke that doesn't have a question in it, but the question does show up in all of these other instances. Now, if you look at my joke that doesn't have a question, it doesn't stand out very much. Maybe you might decide that you want your answer-only jokes, your punchline-only jokes, to look a little bit different. Maybe to be grayed out or to be a totally different color or underlined, I don't know, something. Pause the video for a second and think how you might do that using inline styling and JavaScript the way that we did in line 6. Maybe what I might do is on my answers H3 is add an inline style with an object that says the color should be, and then do something similar to what I have on the question part on the H3 above, where I say if there is no props dot question, then I might want the color to be, I don't know, some kind of gray. This is pretty contrived, but you get the idea. We can start using the differing props that come into our component to display things differently. And as such, our joke component is now more or less reusable. We can add jokes that just have punchlines and jokes that have both questions and punchlines. And automatically, the joke component knows how to style itself based on the incoming props. And that's pretty much it for this practice. Feel free to pause this and play with this as much as you want before moving on.